From the moment the tension begins to quietly coil beneath the polished surface of the bold and the beautiful on Thursday, April 16th, there is a sense that the story is no longer simply about love or even betrayal, but about the unbearable weight of knowing the truth and choosing what to do with it. And nowhere is that weight felt more intensely than within Daphne, who has reached a point where silence is no longer a refuge, but a prison, tightening around her with every passing moment as she replays the memory of what she witnessed, the precise, calculated motion of Ivy slipping Electra's letter into her own possession, an act so deceptively small, yet so devastating in its consequences that it has managed to fracture a relationship built on genuine affection and trust, leaving behind a distorted version of reality that Electra has been forced to accept as truth. And Daphne, who once believed that confronting Ivy privately would be enough to contain the damage, now finds herself confronting a far more difficult realization, that the harm has already spread too far, that the lie has taken root in the hearts of the people it was meant to deceive, and that her inaction has allowed it to grow unchecked, transforming her from a passive observer into an unwilling accomplice in a narrative she never intended to support. And this recognition does not come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, painful accumulation of doubt and guilt, each moment of hesitation adding another layer to the burden she carries, until it becomes impossible for her to ignore the simple, undeniable truth that doing nothing is no longer an option. At the same time, Ivy continues to operate with a level of composure that borders on chilling, her actions guided not by impulsive emotion, but by a carefully constructed vision of how things should be. A vision in which Electra's future is not left to chance, but shaped according to Ivy's own understanding of what is best. And in this vision, Will has no place, not because he is inherently unworthy, but because he represents a variable that Ivy cannot control, and control, more than anything else, is what she seeks, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but out of a deeply ingrained belief that she alone can see the bigger picture, that she alone understands what Electra truly needs, and this belief allows her to justify actions that would otherwise be indefensible. To rationalize the theft of a letter, the manipulation of circumstances, the subtle rewriting of events, all in the name of protecting someone who has never asked to be protected in this way. And it is this quiet conviction that makes Ivy such a formidable force. Because she does not see herself as a villain. She sees herself as a guardian. And it is precisely this self-perception that blinds her to the damage she is causing, allowing her to move forward with a calm certainty that makes her manipulations all the more effective. Especially when she begins to align herself more closely with RJ, who, despite his own emotional turmoil, becomes an increasingly important piece in her strategy. RJ, for his part, stands at a crossroads defined not by clear choices, but by competing loyalties and unresolved emotions. His feelings for Electra creating a vulnerability that Ivy is quick to recognize and, perhaps unintentionally, exploit, and after the stern warning from his father, Ridge Forrester, RJ finds himself grappling not only with his personal frustrations, but with a sense of inadequacy that lingers beneath the surface, a feeling that he must prove himself, that he must take decisive action rather than remain on the sidelines. And it is within this emotional state that Ivy's influence becomes particularly potent, because she offers him a sense of purpose, a way to channel his feelings into something that appears constructive, encouraging him to see himself not as a rival to Will, but as a protector of Electra, someone who can help guide her toward a better future. And this framing allows RJ to justify his growing involvement, to convince himself that his actions are motivated by care rather than competition, even as they begin to mirror the manipulative patterns established by Ivy, creating a subtle but significant shift in his character, one that blurs the line between genuine concern and self-serving desire. Meanwhile, Electra remains caught in the center of this carefully orchestrated storm, her internal conflict deepening as the contradictions in her reality become harder to ignore, because while she continues to carry the pain of what she believes Will has done, there are moments, fleeting but persistent, where that version of events does not fully align with the man she remembers, creating a quiet dissonance that she cannot easily resolve. And this dissonance manifests as hesitation, as second-guessing, as an inability to fully commit to the idea of moving on, even as she is being encouraged to do so from multiple directions. And it is this hesitation that keeps the possibility of reconciliation alive, fragile and uncertain, but not yet extinguished, because love, once formed, does not simply disappear in the face of misunderstanding. It lingers. It resists. It waits for an opportunity to be understood again. And it is precisely this lingering connection that Ivy seeks to sever completely, recognizing that as long as Elektra continues to feel even a trace of that bond, her influence will never be absolute. Will, on the other side of this emotional divide, continues to fight a battle he does not fully understand. His efforts to reconnect with Elektra driven by a sincere desire to repair what has been broken, yet constantly undermined by the invisible barriers that Ivy has constructed. And when he declares that he has removed the obstacle represented by Dylan, there is a sense of determination in his words, a belief that he has done what was necessary to prove his commitment. Yet this belief is built on an incomplete understanding of the situation. Because the true obstacle is not Dylan, but the narrative that has been built around him, a narrative that continues to shape Elektra's perception regardless of the actual circumstances, and this disconnect creates a tragic irony in Will's actions, as he believes he is moving closer to reconciliation, while in reality he remains trapped within a framework that has been designed to keep him at a distance. It is against this backdrop of misaligned intentions and hidden truths that Daphne finally reaches the point where she can no longer justify her silence. And her decision to confide in Carter Walton marks a turning point not only in her own journey, but in the trajectory of the entire storyline. Because Carter, unlike the others, occupies a position that allows him to see the situation with a degree of clarity that has been obscured for everyone else. His prior intervention in the conflict between Will and RJ, giving him insight into the tensions that have been building beneath the surface. And when Daphne reveals what she has witnessed, the stolen letter, the manipulation, the deliberate interference, it is not just new information for Carter, but a confirmation that the problems he has observed are rooted in something far more serious than simple misunderstandings. And his response to Daphne is not one of immediate action, but of careful consideration, because he understands that the truth, once revealed, will not simply resolve the situation, it will complicate it, will force each individual to confront not only what has been done to them, but how they have responded to it. And this awareness places him in a difficult position, as he must decide whether to encourage Daphne to come forward, knowing the potential fallout, or to advise caution, recognizing that the timing and manner of such a revelation will be crucial in determining its impact. Daphne, however, is no longer in a place where caution feels like a viable option, her conscience pushing her toward a decision that feels both necessary and terrifying. Because to speak the truth is to accept responsibility for everything that follows, to acknowledge that her silence has contributed to the current situation, and to risk becoming the catalyst for a confrontation that could irrevocably alter the relationship she is trying to protect. And yet, it is precisely this willingness to accept responsibility that defines her transformation, turning her from a passive observer into an active participant in the pursuit of honesty, even if that honesty comes at a cost. As the episode progresses, the various threads of the narrative begin to converge, the alliance between Ivy and RJ solidifying even as the foundation beneath it starts to weaken, the bond between Will and Elektra straining under the weight of misperception, and Daphne's resolve hardening into action, creating a sense of inevitability that builds with each passing moment, because it becomes increasingly clear that the truth cannot remain hidden indefinitely, that the carefully constructed illusion that has sustained the current state of affairs is beginning to crack, and when it finally breaks, the consequences will extend far beyond a single revelation, reshaping the emotional landscape for every character involved. In the end, What makes this storyline so compelling is not simply the drama of its events, but the intricate interplay of motivation, perception, and consequence that drives it forward, each character acting according to their own understanding of what is right, yet collectively creating a situation that is anything but. And as the tension continues to build toward the inevitable confrontation, the question is no longer whether the truth will come out, but how each character will respond when it does. Whether they will cling to the narratives they have constructed or find the courage to confront a reality that is far more complex, far more painful, and ultimately far more honest than anything they have been willing to accept before. There are moments in The Bold and the Beautiful that do not simply advance the story, but fundamentally shift the emotional gravity of everything that comes before and after. In this particular moment, quiet on the surface, almost intimate in its staging, unfolds with a kind of psychological intensity that lingers long after the scene ends, because what appears at first to be guidance slowly reveals itself as something far more unsettling, something that blurs the line between care and control, between protection and possession, until the distinction disappears entirely, and all that remains is a young woman sitting across from someone she trusts, being asked not to express how she feels, but to rehearse what she is supposed to feel, to repeat a sentence that does not belong to her. A sentence that sounds simple, but carries within it the weight of a decision she has not truly made. And in that moment, the dynamic between Ivy and Elektra ceases to be familial and becomes something far more troubling. A quiet but unmistakable transformation that reframes everything the audience thought they understood about Ivy's intentions. Because when Ivy looks directly at Elektra and instructs her to say, out loud, that she is with RJ, it is not framed as a suggestion or even a piece of advice. It is delivered with the authority of a conclusion already reached, as if Elektra's role in her own life has been reduced to agreeing with a script that has been carefully written for her. And what makes this moment so deeply uncomfortable is not just the words themselves, but the context in which they are spoken, the deliberate buildup of emotional pressure that precedes them, the way Ivy methodically reconstructs the narrative of Elektra's relationship with Will, not to help her understand it more clearly, but to ensure that she interprets it in a very specific way, a way that leaves no room for ambiguity, no space for reconsideration, no possibility of forgiveness, because forgiveness would require Elektra to think for herself, to weigh her own emotions against the facts as she understands them, and that is precisely what Ivy cannot allow. The conversation does not begin with the command. It begins with the slow, calculated assembly of a psychological framework designed to lead Elektra toward a predetermined outcome, and each element of that framework is carefully chosen, not for its objective truth, but for its emotional impact. As Ivy revisits the moments that hurt the most, the perceived betrayals, the disappointments, the lingering questions that have never been fully answered, and she presents them not as isolated incidents, but as part of a pattern that she attributes not just to Will, but to the entire Spencer lineage, transforming individual actions into inherited flaws, suggesting that what Elektra experienced is not an exception, but an inevitability, something that will repeat itself regardless of what Will says or does, and this reframing is critical. Because it removes the possibility of change, it closes the door on the idea that people can grow or make amends, replacing it instead with a narrative of inevitability that justifies Ivy's intervention as necessary rather than intrusive. And within this narrative, the necklace becomes more than an object. It becomes evidence, a symbol of neglect or rejection that reinforces the version of events Ivy is constructing, even though the audience knows that its significance has been manipulated, that its placement and interpretation have been deliberately altered to serve a specific purpose. And then there is the letter, the most tangible piece of deception in the entire scheme, a physical representation of the truth that was withheld, the communication that never reached its intended recipient. And Ivy does not mention it in a way that invites discussion or clarification. She allows its absence to speak for itself, to create a void that Elektra fills with her own assumptions. Assumptions that Ivy has carefully guided without ever explicitly stating the lie at their center. And it is this subtlety that makes the manipulation so effective, because Elektra believes she has arrived at her conclusions on her own, unaware of the invisible hand that has been steering her all along. By the time Ivy reaches the moment where she asks Elektra to repeat the sentence, the groundwork has already been laid. The emotional landscape has been shaped in such a way that resistance feels not only difficult, but almost illogical. Because every piece of information Elektra has been given points toward the same conclusion, that staying away from Will is the right choice, that aligning herself with RJ is the safer, more rational path. And yet, despite this carefully constructed logic, there is something in Elektra that resists, something that cannot be fully silenced. And it reveals itself in the hesitation, in the tears that gather in her eyes as she tries to speak words that do not feel entirely her own. And this is where the true tragedy of the scene emerges, because Elektra is not a passive victim. She is actively trying to reconcile what she feels with what she is being told she should feel, and the gap between those two realities creates a tension that is almost unbearable. A quiet internal conflict that plays out in the smallest of gestures, the slight tremor in her voice. The way her gaze shifts as if searching for something solid to hold on to. And in that moment, the audience is not just witnessing manipulation. They're witnessing the erosion of self-trust, the gradual replacement of personal intuition with externally imposed certainty. And it is this erosion that has the most lasting impact, because even if the truth is eventually revealed, even if Elektra comes to understand what has been done to her, the process of learning to trust her own judgment again will be long and difficult, shaped by the memory of a time when her feelings were not only questioned but rewritten. What makes Ivy's actions even more complex is the fact that they are not driven by malice in the traditional sense, but by a deeply ingrained belief that she is acting in Elektra's best interest, a belief that is rooted in her own experiences, in the way she has been hurt and manipulated in the past, particularly by figures like Quinn and Steffi, whose influence left lasting marks on her understanding of relationships and power. And rather than rejecting those patterns, Ivy has internalized them, adopting the same strategies that were once used against her, but reframing them as protective measures rather than acts of control. And this psychological inheritance adds a layer of nuance to her character, because it suggests that her behavior is not simply a choice, but a response. A learned mechanism that she has come to rely on in situations where she feels the need to assert control. And yet, this does not absolve her of responsibility. It only makes her actions more tragic, because she is perpetuating the very cycle that once harmed her, extending it to someone she claims to care about. And in doing so, she reveals the most insidious aspect of manipulation, that it often disguises itself as love, that it convinces both the manipulator and the manipulated that what is happening is necessary, even beneficial, when in reality it is anything but. Meanwhile, outside the immediate sphere of Ivy's influence, the presence of Will introduces a counterpoint that highlights the artificiality of the narrative Elektra has been given, because when he enters the room and speaks to her, his words are not rehearsed, not constructed to fit a predetermined outcome, but driven by genuine emotion, by a desire to reconnect and to make amends. And while his perspective is incomplete, shaped by his own misunderstandings and assumptions, there is an authenticity to his approach that contrasts sharply with the controlled environment Ivy has created. And this contrast is further emphasized by the reactions of others, including Steffi Forrester, whose acknowledgement of Will's sincerity carries weight precisely because she is not predisposed to favor him. And if even she can recognize the effort he is making, then Ivy's refusal to do so cannot be dismissed as simple skepticism. It must be understood as a deliberate choice, a refusal to engage with any information that contradicts the narrative she has established. And this refusal speaks volumes about her true priorities, because it suggests that her goal is not to help Elektra make an informed decision, but to ensure that she makes the decision Ivy has already deemed correct. The role of Daphne in this unfolding drama adds another dimension to the narrative, one that underscores the moral complexity of the situation, because Daphne exists at the intersection of knowledge and inaction, aware of what Ivy has done, aware of the truth that could change everything, yet struggling with the implications of revealing it. And her internal conflict mirrors the audience's own frustration, the desire to see the truth come to light tempered by an understanding of the chaos it will inevitably cause, and her interactions with Ivy, marked by repeated attempts to push for honesty, only serve to highlight the extent of Ivy's determination to maintain control, as she dismisses Daphne's concerns, insists on silence, and reinforces her belief that she knows what is best. And this dynamic places Daphne in an increasingly untenable position, because every moment she remains silent is another moment in which the lie is allowed to persist, another moment in which Electra's choices are influenced by incomplete information, and the longer this continues, the more difficult it becomes to intervene without causing significant harm. And yet, the alternative, to do nothing, to allow the situation to resolve itself within the confines of Ivy's manipulation, is equally untenable, creating a moral dilemma that has no easy resolution. As the scene unfolds and the emotional stakes continue to rise, the audience is left with a sense of impending inevitability, the understanding that the current balance cannot be maintained, that the truth, no matter how carefully it has been hidden, will eventually surface, and when it does, it will not simply correct a misunderstanding. It will expose the underlying dynamics that have shaped the characters' interactions, forcing them to confront not only what has been done, but why it was done, and this confrontation will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the relationships at the center of the story, but for the individuals themselves, as they are forced to reevaluate their own roles in the events that have unfolded, to question their assumptions, their motivations, and their capacity for both harm and forgiveness. In the end, the question that lingers is not simply whether Ivy has crossed a line, but whether she even recognizes that the line exists, whether she can see the difference between guiding someone and controlling them, between protecting someone and overriding their autonomy. And perhaps more importantly, whether Electra will be able to reclaim her voice, to move beyond the script that has been imposed upon her and rediscover the ability to define her own emotions, her own choices, her own future, because until she does, the words she speaks, no matter how convincing they may sound, will never truly belong to her, and a life she is being encouraged to accept will remain, at its core,